I wanted to take a little bit of time to share my story with you, give you some background information on how I came to be diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis and how I feel about it and kind of everything that led up to it and what's happened since my diagnosis. So in 2000, I was just, for no apparent reason, just broke out into hives. Unexplicably, I did all sorts of allergy tests, all the stick tests. I was allergic to nothing. Nobody could figure out why I was breaking out into hives. One moment. Okay. Nobody could figure out why I was breaking out into hives. They were not just the small little red bumps that you think of when you hear somebody has hives. These were large welts, like this big, all over my body, covering my body, my face, my mouth, my throat, inside my throat. Every inch of my body was covered, the bottoms of my feet. And that lasted for 5 years. And so up until about 2005, that happened. My husband and I had only been married since 1998, so we'd only been married 2 years before this happened. And then it lasted for 5 years. And just as soon as it started, it just quit. I had been to an allergy specialist. I'd been to my primary care physician, a dermatologist. I finally went to a doctor who specialized in HIV and AIDS patients. And I was referred to him because it was more of an immune issue. And he took a lot of concern in trying to figure out what was going on, but it was just really beyond him. And so I was referred to an immunology clinic. And when I got to the immunology clinic, I'd been taking anywhere, and this was, keep in mind, over a period of like 5 years. By the end of that 5 years, I was taking up to 80 milligrams of prednisone a day. And that much prednisone wasn't affecting the inflammation hardly at all. So I got to the immunologist, and he put me on a program to where we would wean off of the prednisone, which took a huge amount of trust in somebody that I don't know. And I still, to this day, don't know if the medication protocol that he had me on actually stopped the hives, or if it was just my body deciding it was tired of having hives and it just quit, which is kind of typical for an autoimmune issue. So for whatever reason, it quit. And so we're now up to 2005. I am the primary breadwinner in my family. I work 40 to 50 to 60 hours a week at this point. I had an executive assistant position. I also did mortgages. So I was a professional. And over the summer, I started having some pain in my feet. And this was in 2007. So I started having some pain in my feet, and I thought, maybe I'm just wearing shoes that are too high. The heels are too high, or they're just too uncomfortable. And then I started noticing, like, I think I had a pain in this finger. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird. I wonder why I would have a pain in that finger. And I spoke to my mother about it, who's a retired nurse, and she says, well, maybe it's just tendonitis. I'm like, okay, so tendonitis. And then I started having pain in this shoulder, and it seemed very random, and I thought, well, maybe I slept on it wrong. So there was always a reason why I kind of excused away a symptom. And I think most of us would probably do the same thing. We would just figure out a way to kind of excuse it away. But then I started noticing things became symmetrical. So both of my feet started hurting, and then both of my ankles started hurting. And I had accepted a new job. Was it, I think maybe August of that summer, I had accepted a new job. I was the executive assistant to the CEO of a major investment firm, and hadn't said anything to them necessarily about the pain, because at that time I didn't know what it was. And I went to my primary care physician, and he did a few tests, and he recommended that I go see a rheumatologist. He did not diagnose me, but because he wanted to leave that up to the rheumatologist. My mother, being a retired nurse, knew what he was thinking and was very afraid, but she didn't say anything to me about it, just in case that wasn't the situation. So I got referred to a rheumatologist, and so I've started my new job, got referred to the rheumatologist. Actually, the rheumatologist that I was referred to was from one of my coworkers who also saw him. And so I had kind of shared a little bit with my coworkers about what was going on. So every day until that point, I'm having this pain, and I'm wrapping my feet, and I'm wrapping my knees, and I'm wrapping, you know, under my work clothes, my wrists and things like that. But undeniably, you could tell that I was in pain just by walking and standing and just kind of doing normal things. So went to see a rheumatologist, and I think this was like in October, and he did tests, and he came back and said, yes, you have rheumatoid arthritis. And I had no idea what that meant. And the first time that I visited him in his office, it was overwhelming, first going to a rheumatologist, because I don't really know what rheumatologists do. When I walked into his office, there were several elderly women there, and I thought, oh, is this like arthritis kind of thing? I didn't know what it was. And so my mom was with me at the time. She was helping me, and he sat down, and we started talking, and he said, you know, if it were me, and if I had to have a diagnosis between rheumatoid arthritis and cancer, I would have cancer. I would pick cancer. And this is my first meeting with this man. He had been recommended to me, and I was in shock. I had no idea why he was telling me this. And I left very uncertain. My mom was upset for more than one reason, because he had said that, but because also I had officially been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. So I go to work, I share with the CEO who I'm supporting that this is what's happening. This is why I've been feeling poorly. This is why I've been calling in sick. And keep in mind, I had just started this job, so I was under a 90-day probationary period too. And I'm trying to keep him informed as I go along, to let him know what's happening with my health. But the bottom line was, I was not a reliable employee because of my health. And the week of Thanksgiving, I was called into his office, and I was fired because I was incompetent. Not because of health issues, because I could have sued them, but because they claimed I lied on my resume. I lied about my skills and my abilities on my resume, and that they were going to give me a severance, and by accepting the severance, that would prevent me from coming back and suing them for any reason. And so I got called in to meet with the HR president, and that was that. I packed up my stuff and happy Thanksgiving, you're fired. And so from August to Thanksgiving, the disease had quickly progressed to where I was having difficulty walking. We lived in a 2-story house at the time. By Christmas, I was having a hard time getting up and down the steps. Before long, I would have to crawl up and down the steps. And there were times when I would have to get out of bed in the morning and actually crawl to the bathroom because my feet were so swollen and hurting. And during this time, my rheumatologist has me on various medications. And at that time, you had to go through a number of hoops. Insurance required that you go through so many pill form medications before you could go to what's called a biologic. And the pill form medications are like, you know, a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medication, non-steroidal. So it's, you know, it's not prednisone based. And so I can't even think of what one would be, but I take meloxicam, which is Mobic. It's an anti-inflammatory. And I started taking methotrexate, and that didn't help. And so none of the pill form medications that I was given was making any kind of impact other than prednisone. And so I jumped through enough hoops, and I got approved to take my first biologic, which is generally an infusion or an injection form drug. A lot of them are cancer drugs that have been found to have beneficial effects on rheumatoid arthritis. And the first one that I tried was Remicade. And I took Remicade for 6 months, and I was feeling better with it, and then it just failed. So it just quit working. So I'm already into my 2nd year of rheumatoid arthritis, and I've had my first biologic, and my first biologic has failed. And I did 2 more biologics with this rheumatologist, and he basically had a protocol that if you didn't respond to this type of biologic, that type of biologic, or this one, he could no longer do anything for you. And he told me as such on the day that I had my last infusion there. He told me that if this one didn't work, then there was nothing more that he could do for me. So what do you do when you're when you have this disease and your doctor says, hey, I can't help you anymore? So I found another rheumatologist. He actually continued the biologic that I had been given at the first rheumatologist. So the last one that he said, if this one doesn't work, I can't help you anymore. Second rheumatologist continued that infusion, and it was a drug called Rituxan. Rituxan is a lymphoma drug. It's a chemotherapy drug for lymphoma patients. It is a heavy hitter, and my body has a reaction to it. I have allergic reaction to it that can be deadly, can be fatal. And so that became very scary for me to be getting these infusions. So I started having these infusions, I think in 2009. And that particular rheumatologist, he was a good rheumatologist, but his support staff was horrendous. And I just couldn't deal with him. It was more stressful trying to schedule infusions and deal with his staff than it was ever to talk to him personally. And I just couldn't do it. And so I went to the rheumatologist that I have now. So I had stayed on Rituxan, and the rheumatologist that I have now, he and I were talking about it, and we were trying to figure out, you know, so my disease is not under control. If you're familiar with the vector DA test, my vector numbers were like up in the 50s. If you're not familiar with the vector DA test, Google it. It's VECTRADA, and it's a way of analyzing 11 biomarkers in your body to determine disease activity. And it doesn't tell a rheumatologist what medication we'll use to help make you feel better, but it tells them how active your disease is. And anything over 45, I believe, is considered high disease activity. And so for years I was 47, 48, 51. So I was high disease activity. And we had kind of run through this, we were getting to the end of the road as far as medications went. And he's very interactive. He's a very interactive rheumatologist, which I love. He encourages me to participate in my care. And so we just got to discussing it one day, and I said, you know, there was this drug that I took back when I saw rheumatologist number 1, and it was called Arava. And I think the generic name is leflunomide. And it worked for me, but I lost a huge amount of hair when that happened. Half of my hair came out. So I would just do this and just pull out like big, huge chunks of hair, like you might see a cancer patient do, you know, or maybe in the movies or on TV, you see a cancer patient taking a shower and just pulling hair out like this. And that's what it was like. And at that time, the rheumatologist had told me, well, that's too much of a side effect. We have to take you off that medication, even though I was feeling better on it. So I said, hey, what about if we circle back and look at that drug again? And I told him about my experience with it, and he said, well, why don't we approach it with half the dose and see how you do with half the dose? So what we were doing is we were combining the Rituxan infusion that I was getting twice a year, methotrexate that I had been taking weekly in pill form since I had been diagnosed in 2007, and we were going to reintroduce this pill called Arava, or leflunomide. And in 2016, we started that combination, and I had an infusion in June of 2016, and somewhere along Christmas and New Year's and January, I started realizing that I wasn't having as much pain, and I wasn't really taking my pain medication that much, and I was feeling better, and I had energy, and I realized I was going into remission, and that scared me because I didn't know if it was going to be like when I took the Remicade before. That made me feel better for like 5 months, and then it was kind of taken away. It was just kind of yanked out from under me. And so I didn't really know if this was going to be the same type of thing. So I was a little scared of it. At that same time, my father passed away. 2 of my dogs passed away. It was just a real shit show at that time. And so I started seeing a counselor. And she began working with me on how to deal with how I thought about the disease, the realization that I was actually grieving. So when I was first diagnosed with disease, there was a lot of denial about it. I would cover it up. I would cover up the wraps that I was wearing underneath my shoes and my sleeves, and bargaining that, you know, God, if you just please get me through this, I promise I'll be the best person that I can be, kind of thing. And then depression because it's not getting any better, and then a lot of anger, and by the time, and then acceptance is essentially the last stage of grief. But I was grieving for the life that I had just lost. So all of the independence that I had before 2007 was gone, and that person was gone. And the life that I thought I was going to live was also gone, because this was so dramatically different. And so she helped me figure out kind of where I was in the grief process. And I landed on anger for a long, long, long time. I'm still mad about it, but it doesn't consume me like it had consumed me at that point. And at that same time, I'm going into remission. So the frame of mind, I'm much more open-minded in accepting these new concepts, these new ways of thinking. I became much more insightful about my disease. She helped me realize that I had been a victim of rheumatoid arthritis, and instead I needed to see myself as a manager of rheumatoid arthritis. And I could not see that when I was not in remission, because I always felt like a victim, because it had taken away my freedom, and it had taken away my ability to cut food or walk across a room. It had debilitated me. And it wasn't until I was in remission that my head was clear enough that I could actually digest that thought and realize that that was true.